Well, hi there, and welcome to Friday. And I was going to show you out the window, but yesterday and today now, the season has changed. We even had snow yesterday, so we've gone from the upper 60s earlier this week to now into the upper 30s and low 40s. We're moving very quickly into late fall, and ultimately for us here in Minnesota, we know winter can't be far behind. So hence you start to see me more in sweaters. Anyway, today's reading, we continue moving along, and we come to what's considered to be the end of Jesus' public ministry here. And there are a couple of notes. He has this confrontation, as he's had quite often recently, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But before we begin that, let me just tell you that in those days, the scribes taught that there were 613 laws, 248 of them were affirmative, positive in nature, and 365 of them were negative in nature, and there were some who even argued that the commandment to wear fringes on one's garments was the greatest of all the commands. So it's in that context that the Sadducees are regrouping, and they're going to try a little different tack this time. Rather than just come and attack Jesus, they're going to send a lawyer, which means a scribe, one schooled in the law, in essence a professor of the law, to come to Jesus with a question seemingly on an intellectual level. And of course it's this question about which is the greatest commandment. Now this plays out here in Mark chapter 12 and in Matthew 22, but also this same question is posed in Luke 10, 25 to 28, but it's posed a little differently, and Jesus comes at it there a little differently. But we have this scribe questioning Jesus, and we don't know what his tone is, whether it's respectful, whether it's accusatory, but my sense would be that they're coming at it from a little different angle to see still if they can trap Jesus. So one way or another, this question gets asked. And in Luke, when the question gets asked, and Jesus turns it around after he says, you need to love the Lord your God with all your heart and strength and mind, and you need to also love your neighbor as yourself. And of course the question then becomes, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus then turns the question around and goes into the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here, though, he answers them rather directly, and really what he does is teach a brand new teaching to them, and that is to blend the Old Testament law with the new law, the new covenant of love that Jesus is bringing to the people. And so he really is doing something new here in blending those two together, and I'm sure it caught the Pharisees and the religious leaders totally off guard. He's literally fusing the legalism of the Pharisees with the loving thy neighbor as thyself with the heart, and imposing those two upon them in a way that says it's not only what you say, but it's how you act and how you love one another that's important. And so he's not saying one's more important than the other. He's saying they're both together. They exist together. Law, gospel, sin and grace, the old covenant with the new, and certainly we as Lutherans can relate to that. And then he goes on teaching in the temple, and after they kind of confront him again, Jesus comes back with his own little gotcha question and starts asking the people, though the Pharisees were standing around, says, do you know who the Messiah is? And of course they give the pat answer, which they've all been taught, and that is he's the son of David. Well, Jesus says, well, how can that be when David calls the Messiah Lord, Lord? How can he be his Lord but also be his son? And of course, none of them have an answer. There's this deathly silence. And with that, Jesus launches into this diatribe concerning the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. And it goes on and on and on, and he really unloads on them. And basically what he's saying is you publicly act and teach one way, and in private you do another. And we really get a sense of a culmination of what Jesus is teaching about. What I think is interesting is one commentator said that this Matthew chapter 23 passage has been discussed and struggled with over the years by scholars, and there are several viewpoints that scholars have come to. Some have said that chapter 23 did not come from Jesus but was added at a later time by someone else. Some said it's a compilation by Matthew of all kinds of things Jesus has said over the whole of his public ministry. What I find interesting, though, is there are a group of commentators and scholars over the years who have said this is really inconsistent with the loving nature of Jesus, and they cannot believe he uttered such sharp words. And of course, this comes from the people who believe Jesus is all about love and peace, and that's all there really is to him, and we love one another, and everything's rosy and wonderful. But I personally like to see my God able to confront hypocrisy and legalism and false teaching head on, and express judgment for those who practice unbelief, and who can be angry without becoming violent, and honestly express his feelings to those around him. To me, that's a God who is strong. That's a God who is not only telling us to love, but also telling us that there is judgment for those who do not. And there's teeth in his teachings. And we want to certainly trust in him and believe what he says and live according to the rules. But we need to do it from the heart, and we need to do it out of a sense of love and gratitude. It is that Jesus brings to bear in the lives of people. And in order to drive this point home, he has a small lament there over Jerusalem, but then we get this wonderful account of the widow and her offering, her little mite. And he gives this marvelous contrast to put an exclamation point on his teaching and say, here's the hypocritical teachings of the religious leaders. Now let's view that against the offerings of this widow who gives all she has. And he said she comes out ahead on the scale. And I think that is basically the summation of what Jesus is saying here. And he does it with an amazing clarity and a marvelous contrast. And so it's important for us to put a handle on that. And I think all of these challenge us as people who, rightly so, live by the grace of God, trusting in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. But we best not let that message allow us to believe in some sort of cheap grace which says, doesn't matter what I do, Jesus has done it all for me. Jesus has a call on our lives. He calls us into faith, which calls us into action. And so that's a message for today as Jesus puts the stamp on his public teachings, and from here we move on ultimately all the way to the cross and beyond. So with that, I'll leave you to your own study and love to hear your comments, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again. Have a great day in the Lord.